Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This is the non-Western biblical origin of man, lecture number 2. What we're going to get into is the biblical origin of man, because those are the parameters, and we're going to try to understand it from a non-Western viewpoint, perspective, which we'd gone over in the first series, what those perspectives would be and how those tendencies would affect the interpretation process. So here we are in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, because that's our source. So we're going to look at what is the origin of man, what is man, and what's it say. So here it goes on. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Okay, what can we understand from this? One is that God said, "Let us make man in our image." Somehow let us make man in our image. Who was there to be that us? Well, there's some theologians that point out, well, that could be the basis of the Trinity, which meant the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were at the present point to create and let us make man in our image. Interesting point. Okay, whose image or what image? But anyway, so man was created distinctly, differently than the species. Man was created very apart by the hand of God himself. Let us make man in our image. Question: to be made in the image of God, what does that mean? What does that mean to me? Or what did that mean to the original readers and recipients of Genesis? Well, John chapter 4, verse 24 says, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Okay, so God is spirit. A man is to be made in the image of God, but yet God is spirit, which means that God does not have an image, a physical image. That was Jesus Christ, that was born to reveal God to us. But God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. This is what we're looking at, is that in one of the first tendencies in lecture series number 1 on the origin of man, was that one of the qualities or the characteristics of a non-Westerner is the dominance of the spirit over the matter. And so the spirit plays a very key role in the non-Western thinking patterns. And here we have God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So in other words, man is not primarily chemical and physical makeup. That's not his distinctive difference between him and the animal world. The distinction is that he was made in the image of God, and he was given the Spirit of God. And since God is spirit, man is capable of worshiping him in spirit and truth, because man was given that spirit. This is in Genesis 2:7. "Then the Lord God formed man of the dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." Again, just reemphasizing that man is more than chemical or just physical compounds, and that life is not in the physical compound. The physical compound and the physical body is a carrier of life, but it is not life itself. Once life leaves that physical carrier disintegrates very rapidly. And that is where we have is that in the Hebrew language, breath, the term for breath is something that you don't see breath, but you can feel it, and it moves. You can blow things with it, and that's the same word meaning breath or breeze or spirit. And so in this text, it was breathed into his nostrils the spirit of life, the breath of life, the spirit of life. It was a movement that was given to man, and man became a living being. And not because of the chemical compound, not because it was perfectly put together and designed and then left, and it came to life because of the interaction of the chemical properties. And it's kind of like, no, the Bible clearly teaches that life is not in the chemical or in the mineral or in the physical basis, but life is breathed and is a gift from God. Job 35:4. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. So that again reflects the non-Western view of life and of man, is that it is spirit. It is the spirit in man that is different from any physical basis of different species or different beasts or different animals. That it is man was given the spirit. And so the difference between man and beast or lower species is not genetics. It is the breath of life. Even though there are a lot of genetic differences, yes, but we can't look biblically to the genes to give us a separation between man and beast. It is the Spirit of God. It is the reasoning. It is the worship. It is has to do with the breath. Job 32:8. But it is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding. We had seen in the previous lectures that somehow the breath of God is related to man's understanding. And when man then in his pomp, his pride, his arrogance does not understand, he becomes as a beast. Or man embittered in his spirit becomes as a beast. And it's kind of like, okay, so it's not because man has given up or lost something chemically or genetically, but that is not the division or the dividing line between man and others. It is the spirit. It is the spirit within man that was given man to be able to commune with God, to worship God. And that is what the other species do not have. Man was created by God, hands-on, and then breathed into, a process of which no other species was created by. So now we're coming to a topic that is, it's a topic that has created a lot of friction, a lot of tension, especially in our culture, the Western culture. And this here is a work or quote that was in Science, Living Science on internet. I had it's from February of 2020. And this is Nina Jablonski, an anthropologist and paleobiologist at the Pennsylvania State University. She was quoted as to different perspectives of her on race. Is that if man was created by God, and the major difference between man and the lower animals is not genetic, is not physical, but it is spirit. It is the spirit of man. Then what about the different races? What about what we have in the world today, which is creating a lot of conflicts of racism? Well, this is what she has. What she said in her article. She said, "It's true that we do routinely identify each other's race as black or white or Asian based on visual cues. But crucially, those are values that humans have chosen to ascribe to each other or themselves. The problem occurs when we conflate, that's confuse or exchange, the social habit with scientific truth. Because there is nothing in individuals' genomes that could be used to separate them along such clear racial lines. Okay, she's kind of using the term race still within the article, but what she is saying is that they're really scientifically based. There are no races. She says later on, and we'll see it, but that genetically there is less difference between races than there is genetically difference between individuals of the same race. Let's just say the same color. So in other words, if we take my white and say that the genetic difference between me and a good friend of mine that is Latin, Bolivian brother, there is less difference, there can be less difference between us two genetically than there is between me and my cousin or an aunt and an uncle or someone else who is just white as the same. There is less genetic difference between groups than there is within groups. So, in other words, the genetic makeup is not what distinguishes people into groups. There is not inferior or superior groups. I know that in the past there's been superiority by the white group of saying that they have progressed to a higher level, and that's why they're white. And it's kind of like, well, I lived 25 years in South America, and a lot of South Americans have a color tone that is brown and a lot more, let's say, has a lot more color than my skin. But you know what? My white skin cannot handle the sun, can't handle the exposure. And that is what color does. Color is pigment of melanin that gives us protection. So in other words, my whiteness is a lack of color. So a superior race is supposedly because it has lack of color, which means that I have lack of protection against the solar bombardment rays, and so I have to use a artificial protection to go out or wear long sleeves and sunglasses, because blue eyes also are not really blue, but they just lack pigment, and that pigment is a melanin, which is a protector. And so somehow we've turned that lack of pigment into a notion of being superior, and that is scientifically there's no basis for it. It's all cultural. And so anyway, this is what she says here, is that it's true we do routinely identify each other's race as black, white, and Asian based on visual clues, but genetically there is no difference. There should not be a hierarchy of progression or of having evolved to a higher level, because there is no different genetically. They are manifestations physically that are just superficial. Underneath, there are no differences. So again, she says, in short, variations in human appearance don't equate to genetic difference. Races were created by naturalists and philosophers of the 18th century. They are not naturally occurring groups, Jablonski emphasized. Okay, so when did this racism begin? Well, it began she says, by naturalists and philosophers of the 18th century. That is where we get the division and a scientific model that begins to define and designate who's who and how to divide things and to understand things. And this is where racism comes from. So racism, different races. If God created Adam and Eve, then where did the races come from? Well, one, when we intermarry only within our culture, our cultural context, we're going to preserve those genetic characteristics. And so if I stay within my cultural circle of being white, and white is not genetically dominant, it's recessive. It's a degenerative, actually, position because you've lost genetic material. So we maintain white because we intermarry in the white. So what were Adam and Eve? Well, to get all the variations, or even Noah, to get all the variations that we have today, we had to have had an intermarriage. Or not, I don't want to say intermarriage because there's nothing, it's that they married within, there was no separate groups. And so Adam and Eve were probably a darker color, a darker brown. Noah and his sons were probably a darker brown because you can get a white by eliminating degenerative color, but you can't get a brown or a black from a white. You have to have the genetic material in there. How did God create races? God did not create races, man did. But God gave the genetic material for variation for us to accommodate to the different environmental contexts. And so in other words, a person that has more melanin is more suited for a hotter climate or where there is more sunshine, where in a white or lack of pigment is better suited for a darker northern colder climate. Now, how does that affect our health? Well, that does affect because sunshine triggers the fabrication or the production of vitamin D through the liver. And so if we don't get enough sunshine, then we don't get enough vitamin D produced. And so if we're up north and we have a lot of melanin or darker color, we could suffer, because of lack of sunshine, suffer some physical ailments, rickets or whatever, because we are not producing enough vitamin D. Whereas up north, the white-skinned allows whatever sunshine there is to penetrate and triggers the fabrication of vitamin D, which then I could survive better in a darker climate. But those with more melanin, they survive better in a sun climate where there's more sun, but their melanin does two things. It actually protects their skin from cancer. It protects their skin from bombardment of the radiation, where I don't have that protection. So again, the superior race, that's all man-made. That's cultural. And it seems to be races, it says, were created by the naturalists and philosophers of the 18th century. Now, going back to the house, you remember the bottom part? And we'll go back to it, but it's there. Okay, we'll go back to it. Here it is. Here's the house. We have Stephen Jay Gould said the factor number one is culture. Down below. Then we've got the source of reliable knowledge, and then we have basic beliefs. And what is next to basic beliefs? Prejudice. Number two. So that is what Stephen Jay Gould has mentioned, is that there's four factors involved in how a person interprets the physical world, and that is through culture, prejudice, theory, and habit. Now, in prejudice, what does that include? Well, that includes the philosophy system. That's number 6. The development of system of thought and basic beliefs. That is where the naturalists and the philosophical naturalism comes in as a prejudice. Now, there can be good prejudice and there can be not so good prejudice. And in this case of what this scientist had brought up is that racism was actually in the 1800s developed by the naturalists and natural philosophers. So taking the house into consideration, you can see what she's talking about, where it comes in. It comes in at the prejudice level. Acts 17:26. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined and appointed their times and the boundaries of their lands. Okay, Acts 17:26. Paul says, from one man he made every nation of men. Okay, every nation is a grouping of men. And how are they grouped? Are they grouped according to skin color? And it's kind of like, no, they're not. It's national. And what's national mean? Well, let's see how they got grouped. And it's not skin color. Genesis 11:1 and 2. Now the whole world had one language and a common form of speech. And as people journeyed eastward, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So what do we have? Does it say they're all one color? No, they're probably mixed. They're different tones, but they're one language and one common form of speech. Genesis 11:8 and 9. So the Lord scattered them from over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, and from that place the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. That is the beginning of national groups. Based on what? Color? No. Based on language and preference of maybe the fairer skins went together in one direction north, and the darker skins felt more comfortable south, and that is where they become settled and into specific groups and start intermarrying within that group. And that group is bordered by language, not by color, not by tone of the skin. And that's what they also say, scientists, is that there are not really different colors. There are different tones, different quantities of the color, of the melanin, and that forms the different bases. And there is different tone. There is a different tone you can start with, but the majority difference is not color, but we share much of the same pigment, just in different, or in my case lacking, of concentrations of that pigment color. So, wrapping up on the origin of man. This is number 2, in that who is man and what distinguishes him from non-man. Can we classify man as Homo sapiens sapien or Homo sapien neanderthalensis, or how is man to be classified? Because we're always trying to put man into a box and trying to figure out who someone is before we even know them. And we know them because of physical appearances. But really, biblically, there's only one man, and one man that is the father of all mankind. And there are not races, there are groups, and they were grouped according to language, and that's how God scattered them. And now, because of language groups, there can now be a separation of gene traits. They can now be, now white can be a gene trait, even though it's recessive, if we all stay within the white group. But white is not a benefit if you're in a sunny area of the world, because now you have no protection. And so I have to wear sunglasses and long sleeves almost wherever I go to protect myself from the heat of the sun, from the bombardment of the sun's rays. So biblically, there's only one man. There's only one mankind. And there are genetic, physical differences, but there is no genetic differences between groups cultural groups of people that have different skin tones. We just feel, I guess, more comfortable within a certain group because of a skin tone, but that is not why. It's cultural. It is social. It is something that man has become accustomed to, and it is not biologically based. It is culturally based, that difference. So biblically, man created in the image of God. And what is the important part of that image? God is spirit. So what does man have that makes him man? That is the Spirit of God. Now, if man refuses, or man in his pomp and his arrogance and pride throws that, he can lose that spirit. Or man in his anger, in bitterness, he can lose that Spirit of God, and become given a heart as a beast. So that biblically is the difference between man and beast, or man and man. There is no difference between man and man. And the difference between man and beast is not that man has evolved upwards from a beast, but actually that man created in the image of God, failing to recognize his position under God and becoming prideful and arrogant, can lose his position, lose his understanding, and become as a beast. Thanks again for joining me. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. Again, if you'd like to communicate with us, we're at doubleroadrover.com or thn.academia@gmail.com. Thanks again. This is Origin of Man, Part 2. Thank you again.